wake of heartbreak, on a voyage to visit family in New York, one woman discovers that love may still find her when she least expects it. A Widow at Sea, a Regency romance of love, loss, and second chances, begins now. Chapter 1. All That Was Golden. Ashcombe Manor, Gloucestershire, Spring, 1814. James had already risen. She heard him across the room, humming, a low, tuneless sound, as he poured hot water into the basin. He always did that, always warmed it for her before she opened her eyes. "You'll spoil me," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. He turned with a smile that still had the power to steal her breath. "That is the general idea." Eleanor propped herself against the pillows, her nightgown soft against her collarbone. James crossed the room and placed a steaming cup of tea into her hands, brushing a kiss to her temple as he did so. Outside, birdsong spilled into the garden. Through the window, she could see the orchard, where white blossoms had just begun to bloom. "We should picnic today," she said softly. "Take Maggie and pretend we haven't a care in the world." James raised a brow in mock offence. "I never have a care in the world. You carry all of mine for me." She swatted at his arm, smiling. But there was truth in the jest. James, steady, open-hearted James, was a man others leaned on. But it was Eleanor who managed the household accounts, who tracked the tenants, who remembered which ewes were due to lamb. He never called her clever, not aloud, but she saw it in the way he deferred to her, quietly, reverently. Their 4-year-old daughter burst into the room moments later, curls tousled from sleep, clutching her faded cloth doll by the arm. "Papa! Mama! There are lambs!" James scooped her up in one smooth motion, spinning her until she squealed with delighted laughter. "There are always lambs, Poppet. They make it their life's work to be adorable." "But these are new lambs," Maggie insisted, giggling. Eleanor rose and dressed with her maid's assistance, choosing a primrose muslin day gown with a pale green sash. James stood in the doorway, Maggie perched on his hip, watching her. "You're still the prettiest girl in Gloucestershire," he said, his voice pitched low, meant only for her. "And you," she replied, catching his gaze, "are still the biggest liar in England." By mid-morning, they were walking the fields, Maggie chasing butterflies between them. Beneath the orchard's boughs they held hands, and later, under the open sky, they shared bread and honey. Eleanor thought, "This is happiness. This is safety. This is mine." She did not yet know the hours were slipping through her fingers like silk. The village market was in full bloom by the time the Ashcombe carriage arrived. Stall after stall lined the high street, bursting with fresh bread, spring greens, and linens dyed the colour of crocus and primrose. Maggie perched between her parents, bonnet askew, singing something half-learned, half-invented as she swung her legs. Eleanor leaned toward the open window, drawing in the scents of lavender honey and peat smoke. Sunshine warmed her cheeks, and a soft breeze toyed with a strand of hair that had slipped free from her pinned curls. She was, in that moment, the sort of woman who made strangers pause. Not for flash or flirtation, but for a quieter kind of beauty, unexpected and lingering. Her features were delicately sculpted, yet strong in their symmetry. High cheekbones, brushed with rose, a finely arched brow, and full lips that rarely curved without purpose. Her eyes, almond-shaped and hazel, held flecks of green that brightened when she smiled. And that smile, when it came, was dazzling, sudden, genuine, and unmistakably warm. Her hair, a deep chestnut with auburn undertones, had been swept into an elegant chignon, threaded with a pale green ribbon to match the sash at her waist. Loose tendrils framed her face as though placed there by the breeze. Her gown clung softly to her figure, the cut simple but precise, skimming her waist and falling in graceful folds. She wore no jewellery save for the faint glint of a silver chain, mostly hidden beneath her collar. Eleanor sat back with a faint sigh, one hand resting lightly on her abdomen. That curious sense of weightlessness tugged at her again. Gentle, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw her gaze once more toward the window. James reached across and placed his hand over hers. "You're quiet." She turned to him with a faint smile. "Only thinking." "Dangerous pastime," he teased, eyes warm with affection. She said nothing more. She'd meant to speak to him that morning, was still considering it. There had been signs, nothing certain, but something. Hope stirred where reason cautioned. She couldn't bring herself to name it, not yet. "I've a suspicion," James murmured, low enough that Maggie wouldn't hear, "that you're guarding a secret." Eleanor's heart jolted. "A dangerous accusation," she replied, careful to keep her voice steady. "Your colour's high, and there's something different about you. I'm not wrong, am I?" Before she could answer, the carriage pulled to a stop. The rain began after midnight. Not a storm, but a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the world beyond the windows and left the air heavy with damp. Eleanor woke with the faint, unsettling sense that something was wrong. Her hand moved instinctively across the mattress, searching for warmth. James's side of the bed was empty. She sat up slowly. Her hair, loosened from its careful arrangement, fell in dark waves over her shoulders. The fire had burned low, casting long, uncertain shadows across the chamber. For a moment she listened, heart pounding in the hush. She thought fleetingly of the small things she had noticed and dismissed. The way he had slept poorly of late, the cough he cleared from his throat in the mornings, the faint weariness he laughed away. She had told herself it was nothing. Spring always left him restless. There was always an explanation. Then she heard it. A cough. Dry. Wrong. "James!" she called. He appeared in the doorway moments later, barefoot and unsteady, his linen shirt clinging to him. The candlelight revealed a pallor that had not been there before, his handsome features drawn and strangely unfamiliar. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Bit of a chill." Eleanor rose at once, crossing the room to him. She placed a hand to his forehead. The heat startled her. "You're burning." He tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Shall I send for Dr. Willoughby?" At this hour. James gave a tired chuckle. He'd laugh me out of the village. She hesitated, then gently took his hand. She guided him back to bed, her movements quick but careful, smoothing the sheets, drawing the covers to his chest. She called for Mrs. Allen and asked for cold cloths and tea, her voice calm, even as something cold and tight settled behind her ribs. She guided him back to bed, her movements quick but gentle, smoothing the sheets, drawing the covers to his chest. She called for Mrs. Allen and asked for cold cloths and tea, her voice calm, even as something cold and tight settled behind her ribs. James closed his eyes as she pressed the damp linen to his brow. "This is nothing," he murmured. "I'll be well by morning." But morning never truly came. By dawn, the fever had taken hold. The apothecary arrived, grave and apologetic. Maggie was sent away, confused and frightened, her small hands clutching her doll. Eleanor remained at the bedside, her once bright gown replaced by a rumpled nightdress, her hair unbound, the silver chain at her throat catching the dim light. James drifted in and out of consciousness. At times, he spoke nonsense. At others, he stared at Eleanor as though trying to memorize her face. She never left him. Not when her legs trembled, not when her head throbbed, not when her throat burned from holding back sobs. She wiped his brow, whispered his name, told him again and again that she was there. By evening, his breathing changed. She felt it before she understood it. His fingers twitched in hers, once. His lips moved. She leaned close, her cheek nearly brushing his. "Tell her," he whispered, the words barely there. "Every day, I loved her best." Her tears slipped free at last, silent and hot. "I know," she said. "I know." She kissed his temple, his cheek, his lips, and then there was only stillness. Chapter 2. The Mourning Years. There was the black bombazine, and then the silence. The first year passed in rituals, letters written and burned, condolence notes opened, glanced at, and set aside. Eleanor learned to tie the long crepe veil over her widow's cap without looking, to walk without catching the hem of her heavy skirts. She wore bombazine day after day, its dull black absorbing every bit of light, layered with a high-necked spencer, plain gloves, and cuffs edged in crepe. Even her handkerchiefs bore narrow bands of mourning black. She managed Ashcombe's accounts with ink-stained fingers and a hollow chest, the silver chain at her throat, tucked beneath the collar where no one could see it. The estate continued, politely mourning its master. The tenants bowed their heads. The staff stepped lightly. Time moved. The second year was harder. Not because the grief was sharper. No, it had softened into something quieter, something bone-deep. But because the world began to forget. They forgot there had been 2 losses, not one. She had not told many people. There hadn't been time. Just the hint of possibility, the tender ache of hope, and then the coldness that followed. The child had gone so quietly, as if it knew it was not meant to stay. Eleanor did not mourn aloud. She simply folded the pain into the greater silence James had left behind. The cards began arriving by spring. "You mustn't hide yourself away, dearest. James would not want you alone. Surely it's time to live again. There's a gentleman from Hampshire I think you ought to meet." Eleanor read them all and answered none. She kept each letter in a drawer beside James's locket, folded shut after the first line. Occasionally, when the drawer grew too full, she sorted them into a box and put them away. She attended no house parties. She declined all invitations to London. She wore black, true black, not half mourning grey or lilac, for far longer than society considered tasteful. Maggie grew. She learned to read. She laughed with the cook. She began asking questions Eleanor could not always answer. "Will you marry someone else, Mamma?" "No," Eleanor replied. Always no. Sometimes her brother George would visit from New York, full of loud American optimism and exasperating plans. "You're too young to live like a ghost," he said once, standing in the parlour with his arms folded. "You're 28, not 80. "I had what I wanted," Eleanor said simply. "Not all women do. I have no interest in bartering for less." She saw the pity in his eyes and hated him for it. It was only for Maggie's sake that she finally agreed to the voyage. A change of air, George had said. New people. A wider world. She could stay with him as long as she liked, or not at all if she simply wanted the sea. The sea, Eleanor thought, cold, quiet, clean. She packed only what she needed. Mourning gowns still, black silk for evening, plain muslin for day, a serviceable bombazine for travel, its weight both practical and penitent, high-necked chemisettes with narrow lace trim, black gloves in both kid leather and cotton, a veil of crepe carefully folded in tissue, her pelisse, her spencer, her walking boots, a simple widow's cap, though she rarely wore it anymore. She chose each item with the precision of habit, not sentiment. Mourning had become her armour, layers of shadow she understood. She wore her wedding ring, as she always had. The gold had dulled over 2 years, but she never polished it. It felt truer that way. James's locket she placed carefully against her skin, beneath her shift and stays, tucking it just below the hollow of her collarbone where no one could see and only she would feel its weight. Inside, a curl of his hair rested behind glass, pressed into place on the day after the funeral, by hands that had not yet begun to tremble. There was no perfume in her valise, no ribbons, no lavender sachets or powdered rouge. The only colour she allowed herself was navy twine tied neatly around the parcel of children's books Maggie had chosen. Everything else was black, or close enough to pass for it. The carriage waited in silence at the end of the drive, its glossy black doors reflecting the grey morning sky. The driver sat motionless on the box, hat low against the wind, while footmen shifted Eleanor Ashcombe's trunks into the boot, with careful, subdued efficiency. From the drawing-room window, Eleanor watched them load the last of the cases. 2 large black lacquered trunks, a hat box, a small writing desk, and a parcel of children's books tied with navy twine. She pressed her gloved hand to the glass. 2 years. And it still felt like the moment after a bell had rung. Everything too quiet, too sharp. Behind her, the fire crackled gently, its warmth lost on her. She wore a travelling gown of black wool, the bodice high and unadorned, with a pelisse of the same shade and a veil pinned neatly to the back of her dark brown curls. Her gloves were black kid leather. Her boots were polished. Her mourning was immaculate. Eleanor had once been called beautiful, still was on occasion, though she no longer cared to notice. Her skin was pale as porcelain, her mouth expressive even when unsmiling. Only her eyes betrayed her, hazel, intelligent, and weary. She turned as her daughter burst into the room. "Mamma, is it today?" Maggie Ashcombe was 6 now, tall for her age, all knees and curiosity. Her curls had grown thick and wild, barely tamed beneath her felt bonnet. She wore a small black travelling coat with neat brass buttons and clutched her favourite cloth doll in one hand. Eleanor crouched to fasten her daughter's shoes. "Yes, it's today," she said softly. "Are you ready to be brave?" "I'm always brave," Maggie said, but her voice wobbled slightly. Eleanor straightened and smoothed the collar of Maggie's coat. "Good. You'll need to be on the ship. Remember what Uncle George said." "That the ship is bigger than the house," Maggie recited, "and that I mustn't climb the rigging, even if I see boys doing it." "Exactly." Mrs. Allen appeared in the doorway, her eyes a little red around the edges. "Carriage is ready, milady." Eleanor nodded. She took one last glance around the drawing room, James's armchair by the hearth, the faded oriental rug, the windows that looked out over the west lawn. Her heart gave a dull, tired thud. She would not cry here. She bent and lifted Maggie into her arms, her daughter's cheek warm against hers. Outside, the footman opened the carriage door. Mist clung to the hedgerows, softening the edges of the world. She stepped into the chill air and didn't look back. The interior of the carriage was dark velvet and wood-panelled silence. Eleanor sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap. Maggie leaned into her side, yawning. As the horses lurched forward, Ashcombe Manor slipped behind them, blurred by fog and distance. The journey to Southampton would take 2 days. From there, the Empress Charlotte awaited, gleaming brass, polished decks, and too many eyes. George had written, "It's not escape, Ellie. It's space. You needn't find anything. Only remember who you were before." But she wasn't interested in who she had been. That woman was buried with James. Now she was someone else. Someone quiet. Someone cold. Someone perfectly dressed in black. The scent of salt and coal hung thick in the air as the carriage pulled into Southampton. Eleanor watched the harbour rise into view. Masts like needles against the morning haze, gulls wheeling overhead, and the low murmur of men shouting over the creak of timber and the thud of crates. The world here was all motion and metal, and the sea stretched beyond it in cold, pewter promise. Maggie pressed her nose to the glass. "Is that our ship?" She pointed to the largest vessel moored at the far end of the quay. The Empress Charlotte, painted deep green and gold, her name gilded across the hull, stood proud among the smaller, plainer ships, steam coils rising in slow ribbons from her mid-deck chimney. "That's her," Eleanor confirmed. Her stomach clenched, not with nerves, exactly, with resistance. The kind that came from knowing you were about to do something you had no desire to do, but could no longer avoid. The carriage rolled to a halt beside the pier. Footmen descended first, collecting luggage, while Mrs. Allen clambered out behind them with a tart mutter about sea winds and salt ruining perfectly good gloves. Eleanor stepped out last. The wind caught the hem of her black pelisse and tugged at her veil. She adjusted her hat and stood tall, Maggie beside her, the two of them stark against the chaotic backdrop of sailors, trunks, barrels, and shouting stevedores. A harried young officer checked her name against a passenger list. "Lady Ashcombe, I, stateroom B4. Steward will take your trunks. You've passage confirmed for 2 adults and a..." He glanced at Maggie. "A child?" "She is my daughter." "Right then. Welcome aboard." They were led up the gangway, Maggie gripping Eleanor's hand tightly. The wooden planks trembled beneath them, reminding Eleanor that the ship was not still, not solid. Her boots clicked quietly with every step. She ignored the sidelong glances from other passengers, the way their eyes lingered on her black gown and veiled hat. Widows always drew attention, particularly young and attractive ones. She despised it. At the top of the gangway, Eleanor paused. From here, the harbour looked like another world, crowded and grimy, already distant. The wind lifted her veil slightly, and she turned to take in the deck. Polished wood, coiled rope, iron railings, and gleaming brass lanterns not yet lit. And then she saw him. A man stood near the starboard rail, speaking with a crewman. He was tall, with dark hair swept back by the breeze and a heavy coat flaring slightly behind him. Not in uniform, civilian coat, but there was something unmistakable in the way he carried himself. Still, grounded, unbothered by the commotion around him. His eyes flicked up, just once, and landed on her. He did not stare. He did not smile. But something passed in that brief moment. A note struck too low to be heard, but felt nonetheless. Eleanor looked away first. Chapter 3. Aboard the Empress Charlotte. The stateroom smelled faintly of lavender oil, beeswax, and salt. It was larger than Eleanor expected, panelled in dark walnut, with green velvet upholstery and polished brass fixtures. A wide berth had been made up with crisp linen sheets and a wool coverlet embroidered with the shipping line's crest. A smaller child's cot stood beside it, neatly arranged with Maggie's favourite doll and the fairy tale book she'd insisted on bringing. Mrs. Allen was muttering about the lack of shelf space as she unpacked gowns and laid them over the settee to be hung. Eleanor stood motionless in the centre of the room, her gloves still on, one hand resting lightly on her valise. The ship moved beneath her, gentle, rhythmic, but undeniable. She would need to adjust to the shifting floor, to the creaking walls, to the knowledge that land was no longer a constant. Maggie was already peering out the porthole, narrating what she saw in breathless tones. "There's a man with a big hat, and a lady with feathers, and a dog in a coat." Eleanor turned from the window and removed her gloves, folding them with precise movements. She had not travelled since before James died. He'd always handled the arrangements, chosen the accommodations, ensured her comfort. The absence of his presence struck her again. Quietly, efficiently. It always did. A discreet knock came at the door. Mrs. Allen answered, revealing a steward in a clean white jacket, holding a silver tray with an envelope resting atop it. "A message for Lady Ashcombe," he said, bowing slightly. Eleanor took the envelope and opened it with the edge of her nail. "Lady Ashcombe. The captain invites you to dine at his table this evening at 6 o'clock, if you are inclined. First Officer Smythe." She read it twice. Her mouth tightened. "They expect me to make a social appearance," she said, mostly to herself. Mrs. Allen, already hanging the black bombazine dinner gown, did not look surprised. "You are a viscount's widow, milady. Whether you like it or not, people will look." "Let them look," Eleanor said. "I won't perform for their benefit." She set the invitation aside, unanswered and unconsidered. Later, after Maggie had been settled for a short rest, Eleanor returned briefly to the deck, drawn by the sound of gulls and wind. The city had begun to recede behind them. The open water now stretched ahead, vast and grey-blue, beneath a sky streaked with gold. She found a quiet corner by the railing and allowed herself to breathe. From across the deck, she noticed the tall man again. He stood alone, his coat collar turned up against the breeze, one hand resting idly on the rail. He did not look at her this time. But something in the way he held himself, solid, contained, stirred a strange recognition in her. Not of him, precisely, but of a silence that matched her own. Eleanor turned away before she could wonder what it meant. Edward Smythe had been sailing since he was 12 years old and had never quite forgiven himself for it. At 38, with thinning hair, a neatly pressed coat, and a ship's roster always tucked beneath his arm, he considered himself a keen student of human behaviour. Passengers in his experience were rarely original. He'd seen them all before. The anxious mothers, the merchant boasters, the seasick honeymooners clinging to railings, the girls angling for titles, and the men angling for dowries. So when she boarded the ship, black-clad, perfectly composed, with a child at her side and a spine straight as any duchess, Smythe noticed. He had, in fact, been watching her ever since she set foot on the gangway. Lady Ashcombe, widow of a viscount, travelling with a child and a maid. The manifest didn't say much, but the black veil said more. And still clothed in mourning deep enough to bury a second man. He'd seen widows before, many of them pretty, some of them heartbroken, most of them at least halfway eager to resume life as a woman again. She was different. She did not flutter, nor did she rage. She walked the decks with quiet efficiency, her gloved hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder, her chin just lifted enough to say, "Yes, I see you looking. No, I don't care." She spoke to the stewards in perfectly measured tones. She dined in her cabin. She offered no warmth to anyone who hadn't earned it, and perhaps not even then. It made her fascinating, dangerous in her own way. That morning, Smythe stood near the upper deck rail, observing the passenger activity under the guise of managing crew reports. From his vantage point, he had a clear line of sight to the promenade. Lady Ashcombe emerged from the lower deck stairwell dressed in an elegant black pelisse with velvet piping and a closely fitted bonnet that shaded her features. Beside her, the little girl, Margaret, he recalled, skipped slightly ahead, pointing at gulls and ropes and waving to the engine master with the bright oblivion of youth. Lady Ashcombe didn't call after her, only watched, silent, composed, distant. She was lovely, there was no denying that. But it was the kind of beauty that held no softness. Her face was like fine porcelain, smooth, still, impossible to read. Her figure slender and well kept, her mourning attire exquisitely cut. It was clear she had been admired once, and not just by her husband. A few other passengers had begun to take notice too. An American gentleman in a mustard-coloured waistcoat had asked Smythe if she were truly a widow, or merely in fashion. Smythe had not answered. It did not escape him that Captain Harrow had noticed her as well. Not that Harrow ever said a word. He rarely did, unless necessary. But Smythe had been under his command long enough to recognise subtle shifts. A stillness just before he turned, a pause in thought, a flicker of the eyes across the deck. Whenever Lady Ashcombe appeared, Harrow observed her, not with lust, not even with romantic interest, but with something quieter, sharper, the kind of attention given to a sound heard in fog, or a shadow caught from the corner of the eye. Recognition, Smythe thought again. As if he'd seen someone like her once, long ago, and had never quite stopped looking for her. The saloon was warmer than Eleanor expected, not just in temperature, but in texture. Wood panelling polished to a rich gleam, velvet upholstered benches, gold piping, a chandelier that swayed ever so slightly with the motion of the ship. It was more lavish than necessary. A statement. She regretted accepting the steward's gentle insistence that she dine in public that evening. Maggie had fallen asleep early, curled into her cot after hours on deck and too much wind. The younger maid, Clara, stayed behind to watch her while Mrs. Allen helped Eleanor dress, black silk, high-necked, with beading at the cuffs, and now walked 3 steps behind, her own gown more modest and her cap neatly pinned. Eleanor never needed to ask her maid to be discreet. Mrs. Allen understood her rhythms, her silences, her moods. She had served her since before Eleanor was married, and in the past 2 years she had learned to read grief like a language. "Are you certain, milady?" she had asked gently as she fastened the final buttons. "They'll be watching." Eleanor's response had been simple. "Let them." The steward announced her upon entry. Lady Ashcombe. Heads turned. She felt it in her skin, the pause, The curiosity, the assessing glances. Mourning, especially when worn beautifully, drew attention. That fact both annoyed and armoured her. She walked to the captain's table and took her seat in silence. Mrs. Allen slipped into a small chair near the wall, among the quiet ranks of personal attendants, nurses, and travelling governesses. She scanned the table quickly. One chair remained empty. The captain's chair. Curious murmurs passed between the dowager and the clergyman. A steward whispered something apologetic about a delay. Eleanor said nothing, but noted the absence with quiet interest. Hosting supper was, traditionally, the captain's duty, especially on the first evening of the voyage. Eleanor scanned the table quickly. She recognised the faces now from daily crossings on deck. The American heiress in an ill-chosen feathered turban, the dowager with the lorgnette, the clergyman with the inward stare, and the overdressed gentleman beside her who immediately turned to speak. Everton, Charles Everton, Boston originally, though I've tried to sound less so. Eleanor gave him a polite nod. Mr. Everton. He leaned in slightly, smiling like a man who thought himself charming. Forgive me, but do English widows usually stay in mourning so long? Or is it just a personal preference? Eleanor turned her head, cool and steady. If I answered that honestly, Mr. Everton, you'd be forced to apologise before the soup course. He blinked. The dowager blinked. Someone smothered a laugh. Eleanor lifted her spoon with practised grace, just as a shift in the room's energy drew her attention. A man approached the head of the table. Tall, broad-shouldered with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples. His evening coat was simple, but finely tailored, and his manner quiet. He walked as though the deck belonged to him, which, she supposed, it did. The same man she had seen on deck the day before, alone, unshaven, coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked different now. Not softer, just visible. He nodded once to the table. Captain Nathaniel Harrow, he said, thank you for your company this evening. Eleanor went still. She hadn't known his name until that moment, but somehow she had known it would belong to him. He took his seat without ceremony, offered a courteous greeting to the dowager, and exchanged a few low words with the clergyman. For a few minutes, the conversation ebbed and shifted around her. Topics turned to weather, trade, and the reliability of transatlantic steam. Then she felt his gaze. When she glanced up, he spoke directly to her, voice low enough to preserve discretion. Lady Ashcombe, I trust your accommodations are in order. There was no false warmth in his tone, no charm, no overt curiosity, just a quiet, professional courtesy. But his eyes held something steadier. Eleanor inclined her head. Perfectly in order. Thank you, Captain. Their gazes held for a moment longer than required. Then he nodded and turned his attention to the soup before him. Eleanor did not speak again. She left the saloon before the fish course. Mrs. Allen was beside her in an instant, wrapping her in her evening shawl as they stepped into the corridor. Did you find it tolerable, milady? She asked in a low voice. Tolerable, Eleanor replied, is too generous. Mrs. Allen said nothing more, but offered her arm, steady and sure, all the way back to their cabin. Back in the stateroom, Eleanor removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. Maggie was still asleep, curled deep beneath the coverlet, her doll tucked beside her. Clara sat quietly near the cot with a bit of mending in her lap, and rose only to curtsy as Eleanor entered. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Eleanor crossed to the small porthole and stared out into the dark. Only the faintest suggestion of moonlight shimmered across the water. The ship moved steadily beneath her feet, each creak of timber a reminder of distance, from land, from the past, from everything familiar. Captain Nathaniel Harrow. The name settled uneasily in her mind. Not unpleasant, just unexpected. She had noticed him yesterday. Of course she had. She noticed very little now that she didn't mean to, but names had weight. They changed things, made people solid. She exhaled slowly. It meant nothing. A name was not a presence. A glance was not an invitation. And she was not a woman inclined to imagine things that were not there. Behind her, Maggie shifted slightly in slumber. Eleanor turned from the window, resolutely casting all thoughts of him aside. Chapter 4. Remembrance. The deck was nearly empty at that hour. Sunrise turned the sea to pale gold, the sky just beginning to shrug off its night. Mist curled low over the water. The ship moved with steady rhythm, and gulls wheeled in slow arcs above the rails. The scent of salt settled into the folds of Eleanor's pelisse. She had always liked early mornings, for their stillness, their precision. But now they pressed against her differently. Not aching exactly, just heavier, like silence with a weight to it. Mrs. Allen walked a step behind, gloved hands folded. Maggie had slept through the sunrise, curled in her cot with her doll tucked under one arm. Eleanor had not woken her. The child needed rest, and she needed the quiet. She walked slowly, gloves clasped behind her back, veil pinned neatly. Only a handful of passengers stirred at this hour. An older gentleman pacing with a cane, a steward polishing the brass fittings on the stair rail. Eleanor took no notice of them, until she heard the voices. Two women passed behind her, their tone light but clipped. Clearly gentry, travelling without husbands. They didn't seem to know she was within earshot. "No ring, and no mention of a wife," one said, amused. "I asked the steward and got nothing but a smile." "He's not what I expected," the other replied. "I thought ship captains were loud and ruddy. This one's too quiet, and far too handsome. There's something about his eyes. Something unreadable." A low laugh. "Well, if he is unmarried, I imagine he won't be for long. Unless, of course, there's something wrong with him." "You mean besides his tragic silence and suspicious self-possession?" Their footsteps faded down the deck. Eleanor remained still, gaze on the horizon. Captain Harrow. There was nothing scandalous in what they'd said. No accusation. Just the sort of idle speculation that clung to unmarried men of a certain age, particularly those who refused to charm. Still, the words echoed. Too quiet. Too handsome. Too unreadable. Back in her stateroom, Eleanor poured herself tea while Mrs. Allen sorted gloves into drawers and laid out a clean pelisse for the day. The locket at Eleanor's throat felt heavier than usual. She caught her reflection in the mirror above the basin. Pale skin, well-fitted mourning, a face more composed than she felt. Her hair was perfectly pinned, but something behind her eyes looked unfamiliar. She had no interest in gossip. Never had. But something in the women's tone had lingered. Not jealousy, not pity, curiosity. And the way he had looked at her last night, not searching, not flirtatious, just present, seen. She exhaled. Unsettled. Not because of what they said, but because she had noticed the same things. And unlike them, she wasn't looking to be charmed. She was trying not to feel anything at all. The ship had settled into its rhythm. By the third day at sea, the creaks and groans of the Empress Charlotte had become part of Eleanor's breathing. Wood flexing underfoot, water murmuring along the hull, voices rising and falling just beyond her door. She welcomed the quiet. Maggie was on the nursery deck with the ship's governess and 3 other children, learning to fold napkins and name the constellations. Eleanor had declined an invitation to a needlework circle on the promenade, and Mrs. Allen had gone below to fetch fresh gloves, which left Eleanor, blessedly, alone. She sat by the porthole, the sea slanting blue and endless beyond the glass. Her tea had gone cold. The pages of her book remained unread. The locket at her throat felt heavier than usual. Without willing it, her fingers found it, thumb brushing the smooth silver, tracing the hinge. She opened it. My first. My always. The words still had the power to draw breath from her lungs. It had been early June, 2 years ago. The wisteria had bloomed late, spilling purple and pale blue across the trellis outside the east-facing parlour. James had taken her hand after breakfast. Tea and blackcurrant jam. Maggie already off chasing bees with her nurse. And led her through the dew-wet garden. "You'll ruin my slippers," she'd said, laughing. He kissed her wrist. "Then I'll buy you new ones." They walked beneath the roses, her fingertips trailing the hedgerows. The sun was soft, the sky marbled with cloud. The air smelled of cut grass and lavender, heavy and green. He had stopped beneath the apple tree. "Do you know," he said, brushing a petal from her shoulder, "that I still fall in love with you every morning?" Eleanor had felt the words settle inside her like sunlight on water. She hadn't answered. She had only pulled him close and kissed him the way she did when words weren't enough. That night, he gave her the locket. And 3 days later, he fell ill. She closed it now, slowly, carefully, and set it back against her skin. The ache was sharp today, not only for James, but for the certainty she had known when she loved him. The solidness of it, the safety. Everything since had felt like walking on a deck that never stopped shifting. A knock sounded at the cabin door. "Milady," came Mrs. Allen's voice. "Shall I lay out your grey bombazine for the afternoon deck walk?" Eleanor stood. "No," she said after a moment. "The lavender." A pause. "Yes, milady." The lavender bombazine was simply cut, high-waisted, with narrow sleeves and a modest square neckline. The colour was so pale it passed for grey in shadow, subdued enough to honour mourning convention, yet softened by light. In sunlight, it revealed a whisper of warmth, a hesitant step toward colour, toward something like living. It was the first thing she had worn in 2 years that wasn't black. Eleanor felt the change before she saw it in the mirror. Subtle, disobedient. She didn't want to explain it. Not to Mrs. Allen, who said nothing as she adjusted the waist. Not to the passengers who would murmur behind fans or folded newspapers. And certainly not to herself. It was just a gown. And a change in temperature. Nothing more. She stepped out onto the promenade deck with Maggie beside her, the child tugging her hand and skipping with delight. "Look, Mama," Maggie said. "I think we'll see dolphins today. The steward said so." "Did he?" Eleanor asked softly, her gaze drifting toward the waves. "That's very optimistic of him." The wind caught her veil, not full widow's crepe today, but a sheer gauze, pinned lightly beneath her bonnet. The salt air tasted brighter than it had the day before. Her gloves were pale grey. Her shoes had violet ribbon. Everything had changed, and nothing had. Passengers noticed. They always did. From behind her, a woman's voice floated up, brittle with sweetness. "How quickly some recover, don't you think?" "I heard she refused every invitation for 2 years," came the reply. "But I suppose shipboard air loosens even the tightest laces." Eleanor didn't turn. She didn't need to. Mrs. Allen, walking a few steps behind with her usual quiet vigilance, cleared her throat just loudly enough to hush the murmurs. Maggie skipped toward a porthole and pressed her face to the glass. "No dolphins yet." "Keep watching," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "They're shy." And then he was there. Not near her, not looking at her, but present all the same. Captain Harrow stood farther down the deck, one hand resting on the rail, his coat dark against the sea. He wore no hat. The wind moved his hair. His stance was still, as always, shoulders straight, gaze fixed outward. She meant to glance past him. She didn't. There was no mistaking the flicker in his expression when he turned and caught sight of her. Not surprise, not admiration. Something quieter, sharper. As though he understood exactly what it meant, that she was no longer in black, and respected her for not pretending it meant nothing. Their eyes held a breath too long. Eleanor looked away first. She did not speak of it. She walked the deck once, then twice, Maggie skipping at her side. She said all the right things. Her posture never faltered. But beneath it all, her heart was beating again, troublesome, sudden, and unwelcome. She had not missed it, but there it was. Maggie had gone to the nursery deck again, eager to hear more stories from the ship's governess. Her absence left the room echoing with soft movement. The rustle of silk, the creak of cabinetry, the distant hum of steam above the deck. Eleanor stood beside the porthole for a long moment, one hand resting on the brass latch. Her reflection stared back at her. A woman dressed, not in black, but in lavender. Not a widow, precisely. Not a wife. Something in between. Something undefined. She opened the latch slightly and let the sea air drift in. A knock. Not Mrs. Allen. She was still tidying. Not Maggie. When Eleanor opened the door, a steward stood waiting with a silver salver. "A note for you, milady," he said, bowing slightly. She accepted it without expression. "Lady Ashcombe, the weather may be poor tomorrow. Should your daughter wish to see the Wheelhouse before it worsens, I will instruct my first officer to receive her in the morning. Respectfully, Captain Harrow." No signature beyond that, no invitation, nothing presumptuous, just a gesture. She read it twice, then folded it and slipped it into the drawer beside her locket. That evening, after supper, Eleanor sat on the settee with her hair unpinned, brushing it in long, silent strokes. Maggie curled beside her with a picture book, legs tucked beneath her. After a few quiet minutes, the little girl looked up. "Mamma?" "Yes." "Did Papa ever see you wear lavender?" Eleanor's hand stilled on the brush. "No," she said softly. "He didn't." Maggie seemed to consider that. "Do you think he would have liked it?" Eleanor looked down at her daughter's face. So open, so guileless, and so painfully like James around the eyes. Her throat tightened. "I think," she said carefully, "he would have loved me in anything." Maggie nodded, as though this made perfect sense. "I think so too." She leaned her head against Eleanor's arm, and they sat like that for a long time, one clinging to what was, the other beginning to wonder what might be. Chapter 5. The Wheelhouse. "I may remind you, Miss Ashcombe," Mr. Smythe said with mock sternness, "that under no circumstances are young ladies permitted to commandeer Her Majesty's helm." Maggie giggled and squared her shoulders like a tiny officer. "Aye, Mr. Smythe." Eleanor stood in the doorway of the Wheelhouse, half inside, half out, watching as her daughter clambered up the wooden step beside the great brass wheel. The room smelled of salt and iron and polished oak. Sunlight poured through the angled windows, warming the fittings and casting golden bars across the floor. She wore a dove grey gown, modestly cut, with a high neckline and long sleeves. Its fine muslin dyed a soft dove grey that caught the light like mist. A narrow ribbon, the colour of approaching rain, was tied at the waist, subtler than lavender, gentler than black. She still wore the veil, its black netting a quiet echo of grief, though it lay now against her back, rather than drawn across her face. It was the attire of a woman in mourning, yes, but no longer one content to live entirely in shadow. Mr. Smythe glanced over and gave her a slight nod. "She's bright, your daughter. Fearless, too." "She takes after her father," Eleanor said quietly. He didn't press. "Captain Harrow should be along shortly. He asked me to see the child settled before he joined you." "You. Not you both. Not the party." Eleanor's stomach gave the smallest twist. She turned toward the windows. Maggie, meanwhile, was full of questions. "What happens if there's a whale in front of the ship?" "We change course." "What happens if someone falls overboard?" "We throw a rope." "What happens if the ship catches fire?" Mr. Smythe smiled. "We don't let it." The door opened behind them. Eleanor didn't turn. She didn't need to. She felt his presence, as one feels a shift in wind or the tilt of the hull beneath their feet. "Miss Ashcombe," said a low voice, "I'm told you've taken command of my ship." Maggie spun around. "Are you the captain?" "I am." Captain Nathaniel Harrow stood just inside the doorway, his coat unbuttoned, hands gloved behind his back. His hair, dark and windblown, had not yet been tamed for the day. He looked exactly as he had on deck, tall, spare, and composed. But here, in his domain, something else stirred in him. Stillness, like the surface of deep water. His greatcoat, a dark, weather-softened wool, hung open to reveal a waistcoat of deep navy, simple but well made, and a shirt faintly creased from wear. His cravat was tied loosely, not in the careful style of a gentleman prepared to be seen, but with the absent-mindedness of a man dressing out of habit rather than vanity. Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Captain Harrow," she said, inclining her head, "you're very kind to indulge her." His gaze met hers, steady, unreadable. "It's not indulgence. It's duty. She's a passenger, is she not? I fear you'll regret that standard when she starts issuing orders." Maggie, utterly unbothered by grown-up tension, pointed at the compass. "What's that?" "The heart of the ship," Harrow replied. And then, without looking at Eleanor, "Would you like to see it too?" The compass sat like a crown at the centre of the wheelhouse, its brass casing polished to a warm gleam, the needle quivering within as if alive. Eleanor stood beside it, her fingers grazing the smooth curve of the housing. The glass was cool beneath her glove. Maggie was captivated. "It moves," she whispered, rising up on tiptoe, "even when I'm still." "It does," said Captain Harrow. "It listens to the earth, not the ship. That's why it never lies." Maggie turned wide eyes toward him. "Do you ever get lost?" "Sometimes," he said. Eleanor glanced at him then. The answer hadn't been meant for the child. Mr. Smythe cleared his throat gently. "Miss Ashcombe, shall we investigate the signal flags? I suspect they're eager to be admired." Maggie gave her mother a hopeful look. Eleanor nodded, and with that, Maggie followed Mr. Smythe toward the outer corridor, her dark curls bouncing, one hand clutching the edge of her pinafore. The door closed behind them, leaving only the hush of the wheelhouse. Eleanor didn't move. She was suddenly acutely aware of the quiet, of the creak of wood, the distant flap of sailcloth, the low hum of the sea against the hull. The air held a faint tang of varnish and salt, like old furniture left too long at the edge of the world. Harrow stood across from her, near the window. He didn't slouch or pace or fidget. He simply stood, still, grounded, as though he was the ship, as though he required nothing to brace himself against the world. Eleanor didn't trust still men. Still men were dangerous. Still men saw things. "You're not what I expected," Harrow said at last. Eleanor lifted a brow. "And what did you expect, Captain Harrow?" He met her gaze without blinking. "Someone who needed rescuing." The words landed like a stone dropped into deep water. "I assure you," she said coolly, "I require no such thing." "I don't think you do," he said, "but you wear your strength like armour." "And you wear your silence like a wound," she said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered in his expression. Not offence, not surprise. Just recognition. They were quiet for a long moment. The sea leaned into the ship, as if listening. Eleanor turned back to the compass, watching the needle tremble against due west. Its steadiness calmed her and unsettled her. It obeyed no feeling, no grief, no longing, only the earth. She envied it. "People speak of you," she said almost absently, "on deck, in whispers." "Of course they do." "Should I listen?" "You're a widow," he said softly. "You've had to learn when to listen and when to leave the room." That stopped her. She looked up, met his eyes fully. He didn't smile. He didn't move. But he saw her. Not as the veiled figure who had walked the deck for 3 days. Not as the wife she had been. But as someone standing at the edge of something else, between loss and possibility. "And you?" she asked. "Do you ever leave the room?" He looked away at last, toward the horizon beyond the window. "Not often enough." The door opened. Maggie bounced back inside, carrying a length of blue and yellow signal flag like a prize. "Mr. Smythe said this one means fair winds ahead," she said proudly. Eleanor didn't look at the flag. She looked at Harrow. "No," she murmured. "I don't think it does." And for the first time he smiled. The sun had been out when she left the wheelhouse, a soft, gauzy afternoon with nothing more threatening than a few clouds drifting over the western horizon. Eleanor had needed air, needed stillness, needed to feel her feet move along the solid length of the promenade. She had asked Mrs. Allen to remain below with Maggie, who was too content with her flags and stories to protest. "Only half an hour," Eleanor had said. She didn't like being idle with her thoughts, but that was the trouble with the sea. It left you nowhere to run. The rain came quickly, not a slow softening of the light, not a few apologetic drops. One moment the sky was cloudy, the next, it split. Wind burst up from the starboard side, catching her skirt and snapping it hard against her legs. The rain came sideways, cold and fine and needling. The sky turned slate. The deck, already slick with mist, grew treacherous underfoot. She turned to go back. Too fast. Her foot slipped. She caught herself against the railing, breath snatched from her lungs. Then, a voice. Lady Ashcombe. She looked up, blinking water from her lashes. Harrow. He was already moving toward her from the direction of the bridge, coat whipping in the wind, jaw set against the spray. He didn't hesitate. His hand caught her arm just as she lost her footing again. It wasn't a dramatic fall. No cry, no collapse. But she might have gone down, knees or worse, if not for the sheer solidity of him. For the first time, his hands were on her. One at her elbow, the other at her wrist, not gripping, anchoring. "You're all right," he said, over the wind. She heard him, barely, only because of the closeness. She nodded, unable to speak at first. His hands didn't move. They stood like that for a moment, breathing, rain falling, the ship rolling beneath them. Then she stepped back, gently. He released her immediately. "I'm fine," she said, sharper than she meant. "It was foolish of me to be out." "You're allowed to be foolish," he said. "It means you're still alive." She looked at him, startled. And for the first time, she realized something. He had been watching her. Not like the passengers did, with pity or idle speculation. Not like Smythe did, with cautious professional concern. Harrow's gaze wasn't curious. It wasn't possessive. It was simply present. As if he had known she would come out. As if he had known what the storm might do. They stood beneath the overhang in partial shelter. The rain hammered down around them, streaming off the rigging, pooling along the deck edges. "I should return to my cabin," she said after a beat. He nodded once. She hesitated. Then, quietly, as if it cost her something. "Thank you." He gave her the barest smile. "Any time, Lady Ashcombe." She left without looking back, but her skin still burned where his hands had been. Chapter 6. Crossings. The steward knocked just after breakfast. The tray still sat near the window, silver covers askew, the remnants of a quiet morning meal shared between Eleanor and Maggie. Thin slices of honey-glazed ham had cooled on a china plate, beside soft-boiled eggs, with their tops neatly removed. There had been warm rolls, still fragrant with yeast and caraway, alongside a pat of salted butter and a pot of damson plum preserve. The tea, strong and slightly smoky, had been poured into porcelain cups painted with tiny violets. Maggie had eaten 2 rolls and licked jam from her fingers when she thought no one was looking. Now she curled up on the rug, reading aloud to her doll in a whisper, her voice lilting over invented words. Eleanor sat by the porthole, hair half-pinned, her second cup of tea cooling in her hand. She had not yet reached for the morning's novel. Her thoughts drifted too easily of late. Mrs. Allen opened the door and returned with a small bundle, 2 neatly folded letters tied in twine, the topmost bearing Eleanor's name in the unmistakable hand of her sister-in-law, Cecilia Greystone. The steward bowed. Mail brought aboard from the cork tender, milady. The captain had arranged a dispatch transfer mid-route. Eleanor's breath caught. It had been over a fortnight since she'd written to anyone at home. She had not expected a reply so soon. Her fingers hesitated at the twine, heart stammering in a rhythm she hadn't permitted in days. She untied the bundle carefully, breaking the wax seal. Dearest Eleanor, I hope this reaches you while still at sea. There is no crisis, but some news, and I confess, it troubles me enough to write early. Your brother has done what brothers will do. He has mentioned your arrival to a certain acquaintance of his in New York. A widower, recently returned from Boston, with 2 grown daughters and a comfortable estate, just outside the city. I believe you may have met him once, briefly, some years ago. His name is Mr. Jonathan Archer. George says he is respectable, kind, and well settled. I can already hear your sigh from across the Atlantic. But dearest, I do wonder, what would it cost you to meet him? I only want to see you happy again, not simply enduring. Yours always, Cecilia *. Eleanor let the letter fall into her lap. Mrs. Allen stood silently nearby, perhaps sensing the weight of what the letter carried. Maggie glanced up. Is it from Aunt Cecilia? Yes. Is she coming on the ship? No, darling. Eleanor folded the letter slowly, deliberately. So. The world had not waited, nor had it forgotten. It had simply paused long enough for the gossip to ripen. And now it was preparing its next season's harvest, one in which she, widow or not, was expected to bloom again. It made her feel tired in her bones, but also restless. Because when she pictured this Mr. Archer, respectable, kind, well settled, it wasn't admiration she felt. It was disinterest, and worse still, comparison. She hadn't meant to think of the captain, but she did. Not his face, precisely, nor his voice, but the space he occupied, the way he stood still and saw things, the way her guard had started to slip when she didn't mean it to. And the worst part was this. Some small, hidden part of her was beginning to say, perhaps. The wind had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to shift the scent of the air. It came colder now, touched by something northern and wild, with a hint of pine or ice. The kind of wind that didn't belong to cities or parlours or lace-curtained drawing rooms. Eleanor stood at the forward rail, her gloved hands curled loosely over the smooth iron bar, the ocean stretching out before her in pewter folds. The sky was washed in pale cloud, but the light behind it glowed faintly golden, like candlelight through gauze. Her thoughts drifted back to the letter, to the curve of Cecilia Greystone's handwriting, always so neat and deliberate, to the careful tone, kind, concerned, but lined with something more brittle beneath. No one had said the word should outright. But it was there, beneath every line. You've been gone a long time. George says you might stay through summer. He has a friend there, a widower. Steady, kind, curious about you. They were not cruel lines, not even unkind. But they reminded her. The world had not forgotten her. It had simply paused politely, and now it waited for her to resume her place in it. The thought made her stomach turn. Behind her, she heard footsteps, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present. Even before he spoke, she knew who it was. I saw you had mail, said Harrow's voice. She didn't turn, not yet. The words lingered behind her shoulder, low and calm and oddly intimate, like the sound of waves under the hull. I suppose I should not be surprised you know everything that happens aboard your ship. Not everything, he said. Just what matters. She turned then. He was 3 paces behind her, just outside her periphery, as if mindful not to intrude. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, coat open, his dark hair still uncombed by the wind. There was something austere about him, but it wasn't cold. More like restraint sharpened into discipline. His eyes searched hers, not with curiosity, but with attention. I hadn't planned to read anything upsetting this morning, she said, attempting lightness. But one cannot predict the contents of a letter any more than the weather. You looked calm when you read it, he replied. She gave a small, tired smile. You must think me very practiced. I think you're very good at hiding what's heavy. She looked away then, back at the sea. Yes, we women are good at that. There was a pause. Too good sometimes, he said. The wind rose again, tugging at the edge of her shawl. Eleanor gathered it more tightly around her shoulders. She was suddenly aware of how far they were from shore, how the ship seemed suspended between worlds. England behind them, America ahead, and nothing but water below. My sister-in-law writes to tell me there's a gentleman in New York I ought to meet, she said, her voice cool. That he's respectful and measured, and from a good family, that I should arrive prepared to be receptive. Harrow remained silent beside her. She means well, Eleanor added, after a moment, but it's always the same suggestion no matter how gently worded, as if grief were a season, and I've overstayed it. He didn't speak at once. When he did, his voice was softer. And do you want to? He didn't answer at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. And is that what you want? A new life? Eleanor turned to him. I want to breathe, she said. I want to stop being looked at like a ghost in good gloves. He nodded slowly. Then perhaps you don't need to begin again. Perhaps you only need to keep going, on your own terms. That surprised her. Not the idea, but the gentleness with which he said it. As if the choice were entirely hers. As if he would hold space for either answer. And you? She asked. What are you keeping? His eyes didn't leave hers. Silence, he said. Distance. A kind of living that doesn't ask much of anyone. She tilted her head. That sounds rather lonely. It is, he admitted, but it's also safe, clean, predictable. She studied him for a long moment. And is that what you want? He held her gaze. No, he said quietly. The wind eased for a breath, and all she could hear was the hush of the sea, like something vast and listening. Eleanor drew in a slow breath and looked outward. I haven't decided yet, she said softly. Whether I'm courageous for staying as I am, or simply afraid of what comes next. Perhaps both are true. She looked at him again. He didn't smile, but his gaze held something steady, something she might, if she dared, lean into, something that might hold. The lamps had been lit by the time Eleanor returned to her cabin. A soft golden glow spilled over the furnishings. Her shawl folded neatly on the settee, Maggie's little shoes lined up with care by the bed, a tea tray waiting on the small table with silver sugar tongs and a fresh pot steeping under a quilted cover. Everything tidy, controlled. But Eleanor felt untidy inside. She stood for a long time before unpinning her hair. The veil she had once worn daily, stiff black crepe, too heavy for sea air, now lay folded in her travel trunk. The morning gown she had worn that day was soft in tone. A pale, grey muslin, high-necked and simply cut, with a hint of lavender at the cuffs. She had not meant to signal anything by it. And yet, she had put it on. It was hard to remember when her choices had begun to change. Mrs. Allen had taken Maggie to the nursery cabin to ready her for bed, washing, brushing, settling her with a story. Eleanor had the room to herself, but it felt smaller tonight. Or perhaps she had grown larger, full of thoughts she didn't want to name. She sat down at her dressing table and opened the drawer where she had placed the letter. She did not reread it. She only looked at her name on the front. Lady Ashcombe, a name that still felt like a title someone had stitched to her back, too tightly and without asking. She had loved James, fiercely, gratefully, fully, and she had worn her grief with pride at first, as proof that such love had existed, that she had once been whole. But now, she wasn't sure who she was preserving the grief for anymore. She undressed slowly, folded her gown, and reached for her night rail. The locket was still at her throat. She unclasped it with care and placed it on the table. For the first time in many months, she didn't open it first. Later, she lay in her narrow bed, the ship creaking softly around her, the sea just audible through the hull like breath beneath breath. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought memories. Not of the garden or the apple tree, not of the sound of James's laughter or Maggie in his arms, but of Harrow's voice. "You're allowed to be foolish. It means you're still alive." And his hands at her arms, firm, unafraid, not to claim, only to steady. Eleanor woke just before dawn, her throat tight, her skin cool despite the wool blanket. She sat up and pressed a hand to her chest. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something dangerous. She rose, quietly, and walked to the porthole. Outside, the sea was still dark, but the horizon was beginning to glow. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, feeling the ship move beneath her feet, and whispered a single word aloud, barely louder than a breath. "James." And then, after a pause, "I'm still here." Chapter 7. The Gentleman. The invitation came by way of Mrs. Allen, who returned from the steward's desk with a faintly raised brow and a folded note in her gloved hand. "A message for you, milady," she said, offering it without commentary. Eleanor took it with mild suspicion. "Lady Ashcombe. If you are not otherwise engaged this evening, might I request the honour of your company at supper? The table at the captain's right has been appointed for a smaller party tonight, and I would be most pleased if you would allow me the pleasure of your conversation. Yours, in sincerity and good taste, Mr. Rupert Leland, Bayswater." She remembered him, slender, distinguished, and quietly pleasant. A gentleman of 47 who had lost his wife 2 years before and now travelled to Boston to oversee his son's new shipping venture. He had a soft voice and excellent posture. Harmless. Eleanor set the note aside. She stared at it for a long moment. Then quietly, "The black silk, I think, and the garnet drops." Mrs. Allen blinked, but recovered quickly. "Very good, milady. The dining saloon was grander than it had any right to be at sea. Crystal chandeliers swung lightly from the ceiling, lit with oil lamps that threw warm reflections across the polished mahogany tables. Velvet-backed chairs were drawn out by white-gloved stewards. Porcelain plates gleamed beneath cut crystal goblets filled with golden wine. Eleanor entered last. She did not sweep. She did not glide. She simply arrived, dressed in black silk with a modest décolletage and the faintest touch of rouge on her lips, her garnet earrings catching the light. She looked, as one passenger whispered, like a woman who had stopped mourning and started choosing. She took the seat offered to her, just to Mr. Leland's left. Across the room, unmistakably, Captain Harrow stood at the head table, and he looked at her. Only for a moment, but he looked. Dinner began with a consommé of beef, clear and rich, poured into warmed bowls and served with slices of sea-baked bread brushed with salted butter and thyme. Next came sole filet with lemon cream sauce and fresh-cut green beans dressed in shaved almonds. The main course was a roasted capon, its skin lacquered and crisp, served beside a mound of stewed red cabbage and sweet potatoes roasted in clove and brown sugar. Mr. Leland kept the conversation easy. Naval politics, the architecture of Boston, the unreliability of young men, and the comparative merits of marmalade versus jam. Eleanor answered politely, smiled where appropriate, and even laughed, once. It was not forced. She liked him. He was soft-spoken and sincere, with a kind face and thoughtful hands. A gentleman who had known loss, but carried it with quiet dignity. If she had met him a year ago, or a year from now, she might have given him more of herself. But her eyes strayed. Not often. Just enough. To the head table. To Harrow, who never once addressed her, but saw her all the same. He watched the way he had on deck, not hungrily, but carefully, like a man reading the weather. And Eleanor found herself wondering, mid-bite of perfectly seasoned capon, what it would feel like to sit beside him at table, not to be admired, but to be known. Mr. Leland, ever the gentleman, rose as she did. "May I see you back to your cabin, Lady Ashcombe?" She offered a polite smile. "You're kind, Mr. Leland, but I think I'll walk a little first. The air will do me good." He inclined his head with grace. "Then I wish you a peaceful evening." "And you," she said, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway beyond was narrow and panelled in dark wood, the lanterns along the walls casting a gentle amber glow over the carpeted floor. The scent of roast capon and almond lingered on her gloves. Her mouth still held the faint memory of apricot tart. She walked slowly, her heels muted against the floor, half expecting Mrs. Allen to appear and offer her shawl or remind her of Maggie's bedtime routine. But there was only the sound of the ship. Wood creaking, ocean sighing, the heartbeat of distant waves. And then, another sound. Quiet, deliberate footsteps behind her. She knew it before she turned. "Captain." "Lady Ashcombe." Harrow stood a few paces back, half-shadowed beneath the lantern's glow. His coat was still buttoned, his boots shined. His hands were clasped behind his back, as always. But his expression had changed. There was no smile, no flattery, only curiosity, and something like respect. "You looked different this evening," he said, voice low. "Different how?" she asked, chin tilting slightly. "Not different, just less hidden." Eleanor blinked. "That sounds like a compliment," she said, wary. It isn't, Harrow replied. It's an observation. And is that your specialty, Captain? Observing women from across rooms? Only when they have something worth observing. That stopped her. He stepped forward. Not too close, but close enough that his voice dropped into something personal. You looked at me, he said quietly. And you looked back, she replied. There was a pause. The ship creaked softly beneath their feet. I wasn't sure if I wanted you to, Eleanor added. But you didn't mind when I did, Harrow said. Not a question, a truth spoken gently. She met his gaze, steady now. What did you see? He didn't answer right away. And when he did, his voice was low. Someone deciding whether she still belongs to the life she left behind, or something else. Eleanor didn't reply, but she didn't look away. Her heart beat hard behind her stays. The hallway felt smaller, the space between them more charged than it had a right to be. I haven't decided, she whispered. He inclined his head. I know. And then, with no farewell, no request, no clever line, he turned and walked past her. Their shoulders almost brushed, but not quite. And that, she realized, was what undid her. He could have touched her. He did not. He let her go, and it made her ache. The oil lamp flickered softly above her writing desk. Eleanor sat before it in her night rail and wrapper, the black silk gown folded away, the garnet earrings resting in their velvet case. Maggie slept across the cabin, one arm draped over her doll, her breath even and soft. Outside the porthole, the sea was invisible, just a dark presence pressing against the glass. On the desk lay a fresh sheet of cream-laid paper. Her pen hovered above it, uncertain. She had no intention of sending this letter. It was not for Cecilia, not for anyone. April, aboard the Empress Charlotte. I dined tonight. I wore black silk and a bit of rouge. I allowed myself to be spoken to and smiled more than once. A gentleman with a soft voice and steady manner told me about apple orchards near Boston and how he'd once considered becoming a minister. He looked at me like a person. But it was the captain who watched me. And I watched him. Not because I hoped he would, but because I did not mind when he did. I do not know what that means. I know only this. Something in me has shifted. I am afraid it is disloyal. I am more afraid that it is not. She paused, her hand trembling slightly, and set the pen down. She didn't sign it. She folded the page once, gently, and placed it in the drawer with the locket. Not beside James's letters. Not beneath them. Beside. She stood, moving quietly to the porthole, and pressed her fingertips against the glass. The wind had picked up again, and the ship leaned slightly into it. Far out on the water, lights blinked on another vessel, a freighter or perhaps another passenger ship moving eastward. Someone else crossing, someone else deciding. Eleanor turned away from the window and returned to bed. Sleep did not come quickly, but when it did, it was quiet, deeper than usual. And in her dream, she stood on a wooden deck in sunlight. She was not waiting. She was walking forward. Chapter 8. The Storm. The air changed before the sky did. It was Eleanor's third morning walk, and already the breeze had turned restless, tugging at her shawl like a child demanding attention. The sunlight had a sharp, watery quality to it. The clouds, once brushed like lace across the horizon, now gathered in thicker ribbons, low and fast-moving. She stood at the aft rail, feeling the pull of the ship beneath her feet. She had once read that sailors could feel storms in their bones. She hadn't believed it then. She did now. A steward passed with hurried steps. Moments later, a crewman climbed swiftly toward the upper rigging. Something was coming. By midday, the sky had darkened to a pewter haze. Lunch in the saloon was a quieter affair. Half-filled cups of consommé, untouched lamb, spoons clinking against china in a half-hearted rhythm. The ship had begun to pitch. Not violently, but enough to be felt. Eleanor kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, steadying herself with posture and will. Across the table, Maggie looked up with wide eyes. "Mamma," she whispered, "why is the ship tilting?" "It's just wind," Eleanor said gently, though her own stomach had begun to churn. Ships like this are made for such things. But even as she said it, the lights overhead flickered, and the floor gave a sharp, unmistakable lurch. By late afternoon, the storm broke. Not a gentle patter, not even a hard rain, a gale. The Empress Charlotte groaned under the weight of it. Rain lashed the decks in diagonal sheets. The sails were reefed in haste. Somewhere above them, canvas snapped like gunfire. Eleanor clutched the frame of the doorway, her skirts whipped around her legs. Her hair, hastily pinned, had come loose in damp strands. "Mamma!" Maggie's voice called from below, high and thin with fear. Mrs. Allen had taken her to the lower deck, but Eleanor still heard her, small, insistent, searching. She turned toward the sound and lost her footing. Hands caught her, arms, strong and sure, around her waist. Captain Harrow's coat was soaked through. His hair streamed with rain, his face streaked with salt. But his grip did not falter. He held her upright against the force of the wind, his body braced like a pillar. "You shouldn't be here," he said roughly. "Go below." She looked up at him, breathless. "I heard her call for me. She's safe. I need—" "You'll break your neck, Eleanor." The sound of her name in his voice, sharp, hoarse, furious, rooted her in place. He reached for the railing behind her, bracing her there. His hand stayed at her back. Not possessive, protective. The last time he steadied her, the storm had only been rain and doubt. Now, it was real. And still, he held. "I won't let you fall," he said. And for the first time, she believed it. The storm had passed in a fury of wind and spray, but below deck its echoes remained. Eleanor knelt beside Maggie in their cabin, brushing damp curls from her daughter's forehead and murmuring soft reassurances. "I was frightened," Maggie whispered. "I know, my love," Eleanor said, kissing her temple. "So was I." The child's arms wound tightly around her neck. Eleanor held her longer than usual. Her hands were still trembling, only slightly, invisibly, but she could feel the quiver in her chest. Mrs. Allen stepped forward discreetly. "Let me finish settling her, milady. You look—" "I'm fine," Eleanor said quickly, but her voice betrayed her. It was too tight, too thin. She stood, smoothed her skirts and turned away before Maggie could see her face. In the passage outside, she pressed her back to the wall, eyes closed. Harrow's hands had not lingered, but their absence now was deafening. She brought a hand to her chest. She didn't know what unsettled her more, the storm, or how easily she'd let herself lean into his hands. Footsteps. She opened her eyes. Captain Harrow stood at the far end of the corridor, his coat still soaked, one cuff torn at the seam. He said nothing, but he didn't turn away. They stood facing each other, the narrow passage holding them like a secret not yet spoken. At last, she said, "You could have let me fall." "I could have," he said. "You were needed elsewhere." "I was needed there." His voice was hoarse, low. "With you." She didn't move. Neither did he. The ship rocked gently now, only gently, but she could still feel the phantom sway in her limbs, still feel the imprint of his hand at her back. "You frighten me," he said quietly. She turned toward him. "Maggie was safe. I knew that." "I know you did." A pause. The ship creaked softly beneath them. "But for a moment," he added, "it looked like you weren't sure what you needed more, air or solid ground." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. "And you think you know the difference?" "I've had to learn it." She looked away, toward the closed cabin door. It wasn't about falling. "I didn't think it was." Silence settled again, familiar now. "I'm not going to thank you," she said quietly. "I'm not waiting for that." She gave the faintest nod. "Good." They stood in silence a moment longer. The quiet swelled again, dense with things unsaid. Then he gave the smallest bow, formal, measured. "Sleep, Lady Ashcombe." And then, like before, he left her. This time, not out of caution, but because he knew when she was ready, she would come to him. And for the first time, she thought she might. The storm had moved on, but it had left things behind. The cabin was quiet, dimly lit by a single wall lamp, its golden glow casting soft ovals across the floorboards and the bunks. The air still smelled faintly of salt and lamp oil. Outside, the ship creaked gently, settled once more into calm. But the floor beneath Eleanor's feet seemed to hum with leftover tension, as if the ship remembered what it had survived. She sat beside Maggie's bed, one hand resting lightly on her daughter's back, rising and falling with each breath. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt split open. Her clothing was dry now, a soft cotton night rail, wrapped in a wool shawl. But she could still feel the rain in her scalp, the cold in her chest. Her skin remembered the chill, and it remembered him. The way Harrow had steadied her, wordless and unflinching, not like a lover, not even like a rescuer. He had held her like someone protecting something irreplaceable. She hadn't realised how long it had been since someone had touched her with that kind of urgency. Not ceremony, not sympathy. Simply need. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if the memory might spill out and betray her. Maggie stirred under the blankets. Eleanor gently adjusted the coverlet, smoothing it to her shoulders, tucking the doll close to her side. "You're safe," she whispered. The words were for both of them. She brushed a curl from Maggie's brow and kissed her forehead. The child sighed and rolled onto her side, her face turned toward the wall. Then, in the softest voice, somewhere between waking and sleep, Maggie spoke. "Are you going to marry the captain?" Eleanor froze. She looked at her daughter, eyes wide open now, steady, curious. "What did you say?" she asked, more breath than voice. Maggie shrugged, her fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. "I like him," she said simply. Then, after a pause, quieter, "He seems like someone who would stay." Eleanor didn't answer, could not. Her throat tightened. Her chest ached in that familiar, careful way grief always did, less like breaking, more like bruising from the inside. James had stayed, right to the end. He hadn't left by choice. But still, he was gone. And now this child, his child, was old enough to sense what had been lost. Not just a father, but the kind of presence who stays. Eleanor looked down at Maggie, small and sleeping again already, and felt the edges of her sorrow ripple. Not disappear. Just move. She stood, walked to the writing desk, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze fell to the closed drawer where she'd placed the letter she hadn't signed. Tonight, she would not write. Not yet. But she would remember. The wind, the weight of Harrow's arm behind her, the sound of her daughter's voice in the dark. Not an invitation. Not a suggestion. Just a child's truth, spoken plainly. He looks like someone who would come back. Eleanor crossed the room again, looked down at Maggie, and whispered, "Sleep well, my heart." Then she turned off the lamp, climbed into bed, and lay staring into the dark, not crying, but not still. Somewhere inside her, something had begun to move, and she did not stop it. Chapter 9. The Visit Ashore. They dropped anchor just after dawn, the pale spires of Halifax rising beyond a veil of sea mist. From the porthole, Eleanor watched a town take shape, rows of whitewashed houses along the waterfront, narrow streets climbing the hillside, and a dark line of pine-covered hills beyond. Church bells rang faintly over the water, followed by the clipped voices of dock workers calling out across the quay. The ship rocked gently as the tenders were lowered, barrels and trunks rolled forward, and the first scent of land reached the deck. It wasn't the end of the journey, only a breath along the way. But Eleanor felt it in her chest, like something breaking surface after too long beneath. By mid-morning, a steward passed through the corridor, announcing that passengers might go ashore, briefly, before the tide turned. The Empress Charlotte would remain in port for several hours, taking on fresh water, flour, salted fish, and mail. Eleanor hadn't planned to leave the ship. But when she fastened the buttons on Maggie's wool coat and saw her daughter's eyes widen at the sound of gulls and the scent of pine, something inside her shifted. Mrs. Allen entered with her gloves already on and a small canvas satchel looped over one arm. "The nursery group is organising a short walk into town," she said. "Only a few streets along the harbour. There's a sweet shop and a church with stained glass they mean to show the children." Maggie bounced on her toes. "Can I go, Mamma? Please?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment, then bent to smooth a curl beneath Maggie's bonnet. "Of course. Just don't ask for too many sweets." Maggie grinned. Mrs. Allen gave Eleanor a warm, knowing look. "We'll be back before the tide turns." A moment later, they were gone, swallowed up by the bustle of the quay and the rising wind off the harbour. Eleanor lingered briefly. Then she stepped down into the tender, alone. The dock bustled with life. Barrels of flour and crates of oranges stood beside bales of raw wool. Fishermen in coarse coats hauled nets and shouted in French and English. A fiddler played on a wooden crate near the tavern doors, and the scent of baking bread mingled with smoke and brine. Eleanor stepped from the launch onto the stone quay, her gloved hand briefly resting on the steward's arm. The quay beneath her boots felt unnervingly still, despite the uneven pitch of the cobbled street ahead. She adjusted her bonnet against the wind and walked, without purpose, without company. The air was colder here, sharper than English spring. It smelled of pine, coal smoke, and earth. The heaviness she had carried since London seemed to lift slightly, as if sea air had burned away the damp edges of her thoughts. She passed a bakery window fogged with steam, a butcher's cart, and a table laid with paper-wrapped seed packets. A woman sold lace and ribbons from beneath a canvas awning, her fingers red with cold. Everything here felt more solid, less observed, less expected. And then, his voice. Lady Ashcombe. She turned. Captain Harrow stood just beyond the crowd, out of uniform. He wore a dark wool coat, the collar turned up against the wind, and no hat to shield him from the cold. A charcoal scarf was wrapped once around his neck, practical, undecorated. The absence of epaulettes and gold braid made him appear taller somehow, or perhaps simply more himself. Without the uniform's formal precision, he moved with a kind of unstudied ease, as if the weight of command had briefly slipped from his shoulders. Eleanor walked beside him in a slate-grey pelisse, finely tailored with silver frogging at the cuffs and a row of covered buttons marching down the front. The high waistline flattered her figure with quiet elegance, and the fabric swayed gently with each step. A darker grey velvet spencer lay folded neatly over her arm, forgotten in the chill breeze. Her bonnet, of soft silk trimmed with dusky ribbons and a spray of velvet roses, framed her face like a portrait, the stiff brim casting just enough shadow to soften her expression. Curls, carefully arranged beside her cheeks, stirred in the sea wind. Around her neck hung a single gold locket, no longer hidden, resting just above the collar of her gown, a private memory worn plainly, though none dared ask. More himself. Eleanor felt her spine straighten, not out of habit or decorum, but something quieter. Recognition. As if he'd found her in the crowd before she'd even known she was lost. He fell into step beside her, as if it had already been agreed upon. The wind off the water tugged at Eleanor's cloak. Harrow walked with his hands in his coat pockets, long strides slowing just enough to match hers. "I hope your daughter is well," he said after a moment. "She is," Eleanor replied, thrilled to be free of the ship, even if it's only for a few hours. Children recover quickly. It's their way of surviving adults. She gave him a sideways glance. Is that experience speaking? He offered a dry half-smile. Observation. They passed a flower cart, early wild hyacinths, cut and packed in damp cloth, and a copper-roofed church rising on a hill above the harbour. Eleanor inhaled deeply. The air was cold enough to sting, but it smelled of trees and stone and something earthy. The scent of life before morning. "You're not in uniform," she said. "I'm off duty," he replied. "Technically." "And do you make a habit of following your passengers ashore?" "Only the ones who seem to need company." She didn't smile, but she didn't step away. They came to a low stone wall overlooking the harbour. Behind them, the town bustled, horses, baskets, windows being opened for the first time since winter. But up here, there was stillness. Eleanor stopped and rested her hands on the cold stone. Harrow stood beside her, shoulder nearly touching hers. They had reached a low stone wall overlooking the harbour, the bustle of Halifax stretching below them in softened colours, slate rooftops, smoke curling from chimneys, the glint of sunlight on water. "Do you miss land?" she asked, drawing her cloak a little tighter. Harrow's hands were in his coat pockets. He didn't answer at once. "No," he said at last, "but I used to think land meant peace. I don't think that anymore." Eleanor gave a faint nod. "No, nor do I." A gull wheeled overhead. Farther down the slope, a boy chased after a dog with a crust of bread in its mouth. But here, above it all, the air was clearer, colder. "It feels strange," she said, "to be here, ashore." "Strange in what way?" She paused. "I don't know. As though something has been peeled away, or put down." She hesitated. "No one here knows me. There's no need to perform." Harrow turned his head slightly. "And that unsettles you?" "It ought to feel like freedom," she said, "but instead I feel unfastened. As if I've stepped out of one life and not quite into the next." He was quiet a moment. "It's a strange place to stand," he said. "Between two selves." She looked down at her gloved hands, fingers clasped lightly atop the stone. "I'm not certain I remember how to be someone other than her, the widow, the viscountess, the example. You don't have to remember all at once." His voice was low, even. "But Halifax isn't a bad place to begin." She looked up at him then, in consideration, and perhaps relief. "Do you know what I thought about when I woke this morning?" she asked, watching the grey-blue harbour below. Harrow waited. "I thought about wearing something brighter, something with colour." "And did you?" he asked. She gave a half smile. "No, still grey, I'm afraid." But the thought was there. He didn't answer. She looked over at him. "It was the first time I minded less." And that quiet confession, felt louder than anything else. He didn't speak, didn't nod. But he reached into his coat pocket and handed her something small, wrapped in linen. She opened it. A single honey biscuit, still warm. "From the Dock Bakery," he said. "You look like you hadn't eaten anything sweet in a long time." She stared at it. Then, to her own surprise, she laughed. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't quiet. It cracked the air between them. And he smiled, properly this time. Not as captain, not as protector, as a man. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now. And then, as he turned slightly to go, "Nathaniel." He paused, looked at her. She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. But the name hung in the space between them, unexpected and gentle, like the biscuit, like the laugh. He smiled again, wider this time, almost unguarded. Then, after a moment's pause, he tipped his head toward the quay. "Shall we walk a little?" She didn't answer aloud, but she turned with him, her steps falling easily into rhythm beside his. They walked back toward the docks slowly, without hurry. Harrow had not spoken when she turned to go. He had simply fallen into step beside her, as though it had already been agreed upon. The wind was rising again, curling around the rooftops, tugging at Eleanor's cloak and lifting the ends of her hair beneath her bonnet. The sky had turned a paler shade of blue, streaked with fine grey. traces of something larger moving in from the sea. The scent of pine still lingered in the air, but now it mingled with the sharper smells of coal smoke and tar, wet canvas, and fresh-cut rope. All around them, the harbour was alive with motion. Sailors haggling over crates, a dog barking from the deck of a cutter, women laughing as they folded linen at a stall. A child ran past with sticky fingers and a candied apple, nearly knocking over a sack of barley. No one noticed them. And that, Eleanor thought, was the strangest part. She was just a woman in a dark cloak, a stranger among strangers, not Lady Ashcombe, not a widow, just herself. She and Nathaniel said little more, but their silence had changed. It wasn't distance, it was comfort. The kind that follows honesty. Not the spoken kind, but the felt kind. The kind that lives in gestures. His biscuit in her pocket, her laughter breaking the air between them, their steps falling into rhythm without needing instruction. They reached the quay, where the tender boat bobbed against the pilings, tethered to a post with thick rope. A steward waited nearby, ready to return the first passengers to the Empress Charlotte. Eleanor turned to Nathaniel. He didn't speak at once. His coat flapped gently in the wind, the scarf at his neck slightly askew. His hands were still tucked into his pockets, but there was a readiness in his posture. Not to act, but to remain. "I'll wait here," he said finally. "There's weather coming in behind us. I want a word with the harbour master." A pause. "I believe command of the last biscuit is yours." She nearly smiled. Not quite. But the warmth lingered. She stepped into the launch, gathering her skirts, and turned her face slightly into the breeze. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't try to stop her. He only said, low and sure, "You looked well today." The compliment, if it was one, settled somewhere deep inside her. Not because of what it meant, but because of how he said it. As if it were a simple fact. And one she might believe. Back aboard the ship, Eleanor returned to her cabin alone. Maggie and Mrs. Allen were still ashore, likely buying boiled sweets and laughing too loudly in the little shops near the quay. The cabin was quiet, filled with late afternoon light. Not golden, but pale, almost silvery. The kind of light that speaks of endings, of leaving, of the moment before something changes. She closed the door, unfastened her cloak, and sat at the small desk beneath the porthole. The linen-wrapped biscuit was still in her pocket. She placed it gently on the plate beside the inkstand, unwrapped it, looked at it. A soft, slightly crumbling round of honey-baked warmth. Misshapen, clearly handmade, still faintly warm. She touched a finger to its edge, then leaned back in her chair and stared at the water outside, quiet and glassy now in the harbour. She didn't cry, but something inside her exhaled, a loosening. After a moment, she reached up to her neck. The locket was still there, warm now from the skin beneath her collar. She unclasped it carefully, as she hadn't in some time, and held it in her palm. Its weight was familiar, too familiar. She opened the drawer and placed it gently inside, not as an ending, but as a pause, not to forget, but to breathe. Next, she reached for the letter she had written to herself after the storm, the one folded and placed beside, not beneath her mourning things. She opened it, read it once. Then, just as carefully, she placed the biscuit's linen wrapper beside it. Not as a token, as a marker, of a day when something shifted. The wind changed. From the porthole came the scent of sea and pine, and Eleanor whispered to no one, "I'm still me." Then, after a pause, quieter still, "Nathaniel." Just the name, as if saying it aloud made it real. Chapter 10. New York. 3 months after the Empress Charlotte docked in New York, Eleanor had settled into a rhythm she had never planned. She sat by the tall front window of her brother's house on Washington Square, watching the plane trees drip softly after an early spring rain. Below, the square was just beginning to stir. Carriages rolling past, a boy darting between iron railings, the distant clang of a street bell. From the back of the house came the familiar sounds of domestic order. Mrs. Allen's measured voice carried up the stairs as she corrected the junior maid, Clara, earnest and quick, to mind the seams when pressing linen. The house smelled faintly of breakfast: buckwheat cakes, crisp at the edges, smoked ham, and strong coffee sweetened with maple syrup, an American indulgence Eleanor had grown unexpectedly fond of. She had never intended to remain so long. The visit had been meant as respite, nothing more. But the days had softened around her. Mornings unfolded with ease, afternoons filled themselves without effort, and evenings arrived gently, with lamps lit before the sky fully darkened. The rhythm of life was brisker here, louder, more angular around the edges. But the rooms of George's house were wide and bright, filled with good light and better intentions. Maggie had a small nursery overlooking the garden and was already adopting American turns of phrase with troubling speed. George, of course, was infuriating. But he was infuriating in the way only a devoted brother could be, insisting on fresh flowers in Eleanor's room, arranging outings to the theatre, and making well-meaning remarks about starting anew that made her want to hurl a bread roll at his head. Still, she loved him, and she was grateful. The townhouse had become a kind of landing place, a hinge between one life and the next. Nathaniel came often, not every day, but more than politeness required. Sometimes with books for Maggie, sometimes with clippings from his travels, sometimes with nothing at all but a calm presence and a cup of tea. They walked in the park on clear afternoons, Maggie skipping ahead with a ribbon in her hair, while Eleanor and Nathaniel kept an easy pace behind. Sometimes he brought a book of poetry tucked beneath his arm, and read aloud beneath the bare-limbed trees, his voice low, a touch amused, always steady. They sat beside the fire in her brother's drawing room, cups of chocolate or brandy in hand, Maggie curled up on the hearthrug with her doll. Eleanor would take up her needlework while Nathaniel watched the flames, his thoughts quiet, but never far. Once he rose and adjusted the draft for her without a word, and she felt the strange comfort of being cared for, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They argued twice, once over Byron, and once, half laughing, over whether pigeons had souls. "You are romanticising vermin," Eleanor told him, nose wrinkled. "And you," he replied, "are underestimating the spiritual complexity of creatures who mate for life and steal biscuits with such gallantry." Some days he stayed for supper. Other days, he walked her home through the lamplit city streets, his gloved hand barely grazing hers. He never lingered too long. He never presumed. But his presence filled rooms long after he'd left them. Eleanor found herself watching the door when she didn't mean to, listening for his step on the stair, waiting, not with longing, but with calm. She was no longer afraid of what might come next, because whatever it was, she had already survived the worst. It was not a romance made of lightning. It was made of weathering and choosing. And on the morning she found herself waiting for him without question. Only quiet assurance. That was when she knew. Something lasting was unfolding. The following afternoon, the door to Dr. Ashcombe's townhouse was opened by a proper footman, as was only fitting for a residence on Washington Square. Nathaniel Harrow stood neatly on the steps, a modest leather case tucked beneath one arm. He was plainly dressed, no uniform, only a dark tailored coat and polished boots. But he stood with the unmistakable posture of a man long at sea. The servant admitted him promptly and led him through to the study, where George Ashcombe looked up from a heap of correspondence. "Nathaniel," George said, rising to offer his hand. "You're early." "I thought it best," Nathaniel replied, setting down his case. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and lemon oil. Shelves lined the walls, filled with medical texts and orderly ledgers. A decanter sat untouched on the sideboard, though the hour was not quite noon. George gestured to the chairs near the hearth. "Let's not drag it out, then." Nathaniel sat, his bearing composed, but not stiff. "I've declined my next command," he said without preamble. George's eyebrows rose. "Have you? That's a serious decision. They expected me to return aboard by spring, but the Charlotte is being laid up for refit, and I saw no reason to keep chasing a life I no longer want." George considered him. "So, you're done with the sea?" "I'll return to England. I've accepted an advisory post ashore. Harbour logistics, trade routes, safety oversight. It's steady work. I'll have a house, a place to belong, a future." He paused. Then quieter. "I'd like Eleanor to be part of it." George did not answer at once. "I wouldn't go to her without coming to you first," Nathaniel said quietly. "I'd like your permission to ask for her hand." He reached for the leather case and opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, rested a slender gold ring set with a small oval sapphire, elegant, unfussy, quietly lovely. "My mother wore this for nearly 40 years. George looked at it, then back at the man before him. "You should know," Nathaniel said. "I'm the second son of Baron Harrowley. The estate belongs to my brother now, and I've no ambition to reclaim that life. But I've never been ashamed of where I come from. I only thought you ought to know." George's expression didn't change. "And Maggie?" he asked simply. "I would never try to replace her father," Nathaniel said. "But I'd like to be someone she can trust, someone who stays." There was a long silence. Then George gave a single nod. "She said she'd never marry again," he said softly. Nathaniel nodded. "I know." A pause. Then quietly, "I'm not asking her to replace what came before. I'm asking her to begin something new, not instead of it, but beside it." At last, George stood and extended his hand again. "Then ask her," George said. Nathaniel met his gaze. "I will." The garden had settled into the stillness of late afternoon. Beyond the hedgerow, a lark gave a solitary trill before falling silent once more. A mild breeze stirred the tall grasses beyond the low stone wall, bringing with it the mingled scents of sun-warmed rosemary, lavender, and the faint sweetness of distant hay. A soft rustle of fabric at the garden door drew his attention. Eleanor had stepped onto the terrace. Her countenance was composed, elegant, inscrutable, but her attire betrayed some quiet shift within. Jonquil-hued silk softened by ivory lace and a moss-green velvet spencer, the colour too vivid for mourning, yet tempered enough to suggest a beginning. A straw bonnet, trimmed with narrow ribbon and narcissus blooms, shaded her features, though the cant of her head made it plain she knew he had spoken with her brother, and likely divined the nature of what had passed between them. Nathaniel rose to his feet. She approached without hesitation. "Well?" she said, her tone light as she folded her parasol with practiced ease. "You have spoken to my brother." "I have." "And?" "He favours the sound of his own severity," Nathaniel replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "But he loves you. I do not believe he ever intended to frighten me, at least, not permanently." Eleanor arched one brow. "But he succeeded." "For a moment only." A pause fell between them. Then, more quietly, "I told him my life has been all motion and sea, but I would forsake every mile of it if it meant I might build something steady with you." He drew breath. "I would be yours, if you would have me." She did not reply at once. The moment unfurled, long enough for the breeze to stir once more between them, for the whole world to ease into a hush. Then she stepped closer, and with deliberate calm reached up to smooth the edge of his collar. Her hand did not tremble. Her voice, when it came, was even. "Yes, I have mourned what was, but I am ready, at last, for what may come. With you." He gave a small nod. "That is all I ever hoped." He reached into his coat and withdrew a modest ring, gold, unadorned save for a small oval sapphire, cool and clear in the fading light. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She believed in usefulness, in honesty, and in never placing trust in a man who could not meet your eye. I believe she would have approved." Eleanor regarded the ring in his palm. "It is beautiful," she murmured. He took her hand and, with gentle care, slid the ring onto her finger. His touch was steady, certain. After a quiet moment, he said, "There is a house in Devon. It was left to me some years ago, quiet, with land enough to breathe. I let it lie fallow while I chased storms, but I've no desire to keep chasing." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I would make it a home," he said, "with you and with Maggie, if you'll come." Her reply was soft, unwavering. Yes. Not because she had ceased to grieve, but because she had chosen to begin again. Epilogue. The house was quieter than usual. Maggie had long since abandoned her lessons in favour of teaching the hens a complicated dance, complete with crusts of bread and exaggerated curtsies. The hens remained unconvinced. Maggie, however, was radiant with purpose. Inside the house, all was still, except for the faint creak of the cradle near the open window. Eleanor sat nearby, a soft shawl around her shoulders, an open book resting unread in her lap. She looked not at the page, but at the small figure sleeping just beyond reach. Her son lay there, impossibly small and wholly real. He had arrived on a rainy April morning, red-faced, loud, and perfect. Eleanor had wept, not from pain, but from a kind of wonder, that her heart, once broken, had dared to open again. They named him Theodore. The name hadn't been planned, but once spoken, it simply fit. He was a quiet baby, watchful, as if he already understood the weight of the world but chose to meet it gently. He slept with one hand curled beneath his chin. His eyes, when open, were a pale, improbable grey-blue. Nathaniel's eyes. Nathaniel entered, the estate's account ledger tucked under one arm, a faint smudge of ink on his thumb. He gave her that look, loving, familiar. She met it without a word. He crossed the room and leaned over the cradle, smiling softly. He's plotting something. He's dreaming, Eleanor said, probably about the hens. Nathaniel crouched beside her chair, resting one arm across her knees. She reached up to smooth his hair back from his forehead. "It feels different this time," she said, her voice low. Nathaniel glanced at her, one hand still resting lightly on her knee. "Good different?" She nodded. Not starting over, just beginning. He didn't say anything. Just stayed there beside her, steady as ever. Nathaniel lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. From outside, Maggie's laughter rang out, followed by the indignant squawk of a thwarted chicken. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. And in that small, sun-drenched room, with the orchard breathing through the windows and her family gathered close, Eleanor Ashcombe Harrow felt that everything was as it should be. Not because she had pieced together what had once been, but because at last she had shaped something entirely her own. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. New tales drop every Tuesday, or on Sundays if you're one of the clever few who've tapped the join button. If you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, you can tap that thanks button right below. It's far less scandalous than slipping coins into a reticule. I'll be back soon with another story, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.